Hello, everyone. I'm sorry again for today's lecture coming up a little later than usually. This is another, unfortunately, an outcome from this whole week, which I have to deal with the whole COVID thing in my house. So I hope that's the last time I'm going to have to send you the lecture on, not in the morning of Mondays and Wednesdays. So again, I'm sorry about that, but we'll try to power through from now on. Also related to this whole crazy week that I've been having, some of you have emailed me about the Monday lecture and the fact that you did not hear an attendance board, and you're correct about that. I missed that. It's all part of this whole being unfocused this week. So everybody will get a check mark for attendance for Monday's lecture, so don't worry about that as well. I also send you a link to the first quiz on Monday. The deadline for that, reminding you again, is this upcoming Sunday at night. You have to make sure that you answer the questions by Sunday night. I'll remind you again the way that the quiz works, because I also got a few emails about that. The quiz relates to the readings of next week. So today is Wednesday, and the reading is going to be irrelevant for starting from next Monday. Those are readings for week 4. All the questions are related to those readings. So you have to click the link, go into that after already reading the papers, and then you answer the questions. You have to plug in your personal information, your first and last name, and your UIN, and then it's going to direct you to the page of the quiz itself. There's overall 7 questions. I want you to answer 5 of them, and some of them relate directly to one article. Some of them are more general and talk about things which are common among all 4 articles. So if you have any more questions about that, you can email me, and I can try and help you from afar. But that's the expectation regarding the first quiz. One more thing that people have emailed me is about access to the article. So I'll just do that now with you. So make sure that you are aware of it, because I replied to the emails and explained that. But let's just give us a second. So here's, for example, that's our syllabus, and this is one of the readings we had for today. So what you do is you press this article link here, and that should jump straight. Now I'm connected at the moment to the university network, and that's why it jumps directly to the paper, and I can just do download, and then I can read the paper. Now, if you are not connected to the university, just a minute. If you're not connected to the university network, and so what you do to find it is you have to copy the name. Just a minute, there it is. You copy the name of the article, you go back to Google Scholar, and you put the name, then you get the response. And when you click something, you have to click over here on the side that it says PDF, and once you click this PDF, you get the paper. Okay, if both of those things do not work, you can do the same thing by logging in to the university website, to the library website, I'm sorry, and just copy the name of the article to the search box on the university website, and that should provide you with direct access to the article. Okay, so that's all the things that I had to do before we begin, and now we can actually start. All right, so a quick reminder about Monday. I talked about the first theories of IR. Both of those theories are in the system level of analysis. So that's how this international system has certain conditions that help us better understand how states will behave within the system. I talked mostly about the theory of realism, about the different principles, focusing mostly on the concept of power. The main argument laid out by the theory of realism is that countries are always motivated by the pursuit of power. They have different interests maybe, but all those interests are defined under the concept of power. So they will try to pursue more power to expand their power in the international system. Because all states are trying to pursue power, what comes out of it eventually is a system structure which is a balance of power, because if one state tries to expand its power, then another state will balance against it, and we try to prevent it from expanding its power. And this is how we'll get a more balanced system, which, according to the arguments by Morgenthau, is a more stable system as well, because each country, especially of course the strong countries, this is the main countries that we're talking about when we talk about those kinds of theories. The they will balance against one another. And the example that Morgenthau talks the most about is the way that the European system was set up before 1914, when you have they have this multipolarity structure, which includes Russia on the one hand and Germany, and then we have France and the United Kingdom and Austria-Hungary, and each one of those countries had enough power in order to balance another and prevent them from expanding their power at the expense of others. Right, so that was realism, and then I talked about neorealism, an even more type of structural theory which emphasizes the effect of the international structure on the behavior of states. The main difference between the neorealist approach and the realist approach was the focus of states not on expanding their power, but on ensuring their security, on ensuring their survival. So states will do everything they can, not necessarily to expand their power, but actually to ensure their survival by expanding their own security. That's what the main reason for that, again, reminding you again, is according to that theory, the main assumption is that the system is based on an anarchy. So there's no one nation that can enforce all the agreements or all kinds of interactions between states. So every state has to only count on herself. As a result of this kind of dynamics between states, we get an international structure, international system, which is based on mostly bipolarity, two strong states which balanced against one another, and all the small states is going to join them. Right? If you have any more questions about it, you are more than welcome to email them to me. Let's move ahead. Okay, so today we're going to keep talking about, we'll begin by talking about one of the important aspects of the, where is it? There it is. The neorealist theory. So I got this screen again, the slide from Monday, just to remind you the main basic principles of neorealism, which I just talked about. So an advanced version of the classic realism, much more focused on the international system as driving the behavior of states. The actions of states are mostly defined by different conditions in the international system. What are those most important conditions? We can view them in the assumptions. First is the anarchy. So every state has only itself to trust when it comes to ensuring its own security. And that's the main thing that states are pursuing, maximizing their security. And they will pursue more power only if it does not represent a security risk. That's just the foundations of neorealism, which we talked about a lot more on Monday. And I want to set it up for now so we can keep talking about other elements. One of the critical elements that comes out of this kind of system and those conditions that the neorealist theory has proposed us is what's called the security dilemma. What is the security dilemma? The definition of the security dilemma, according to Jervis, is the means by which a state tries to increase in security and lead to decrease in the security of others, and essentially also its own. What exactly does that mean? In the international system, when we think about realist approaches, we're saying that every state will try to expand its power or expand its influence, right? When one state attempts to expand its own power, it triggers a reaction from other states, because if I'm country A, I'm trying to expand my own power, I'm engaging in developing more military technology, then my rival will see my action and will be concerned because now I'm more powerful than them. What is that going to lead them to do? That's going to lead them also to engage in those kinds of actions in order to increase their own power, or maybe to have their own influence in different areas of the world. And what's going to happen eventually is that my decision to enhance my own influence or security or power, whatever I want to define that, has led in the long run for the fact that I'm less secure because my rivals did the same thing. That's why this is a dilemma. The expanding nation, I was the one who made the initial action, right? So by making this decision to expand my power or expand my influence, I have to understand that this kind of actions are maybe too much in terms of creating harm to me in the long run. This is why it's a dilemma. I'm facing a dilemma whether I actually want to engage in those kinds of actions. And also we can think about that in a more general sense from all the countries, because if all the countries are following the same thinking, if all the countries are thinking, well, I want to expand my influence now, so I will engage in developing more military technology, I will try and take control of a little bit more territory with my neighbor. If every country does that, and their rivals will respond in the same way in terms of also engaging in those kinds of actions, then overall, all the countries in the world are suffering from a a less security because of their initial actions or the initial inclination to take action in order to expand their own power, security, influence, whatever you want to term it as. Okay, so that's the idea behind the security dilemma. There's a couple of things we can think about, themes of research when it comes to talking about the security dilemma. First, it is one of the most fundamental aspects of understanding how, in a system of anarchy, actors who have similar goals, all actors in the international system has the same goal, maximizing their own security, actually end up in conflict. It is also a rational foundation for what's called the spiral model, which explains how countries only seeking security, instead they're fueling their own competition, leading to an escalation in their relations and potentially to war. That's the idea behind the spiral model. Again, this is this spiral of losing control of the situation because I'm trying to expand my own security, but my rival is worried about my actions, so she will also expand her own security by conquering more territory. And over the long run, I am less secure by that. I'm more concerned by her action. She is concerned for my action. And eventually, both of us are just escalating into a conflict. The second aspect that we should think about, and I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, is the offensive-defensive balance as well as differentiation. All right. And I want to talk about two types of actions that states tend to make in order to expand their own influence or their own security, how those kinds of actions lead their rival to feel less secure, lead their rival to take similar action, and eventually may lead to conflict and make all of us worse off. So the first thing we have is an arms race. Sorry. I decided to engage in increasing my military capabilities because that's how I know, this is how I think I will be more secure. However, my rival, as I just said, feels the same thing. Well, suddenly my rival viewed, okay, so he decided to expand his own military capabilities. Now he's stronger than me. I have to respond in kind. So my rival will also engage in expanding her own military capabilities. So we're actually going into an arms race. That's the idea behind the balance my actions. Now, where does the offensive-defensive aspect comes into play? It comes into play in the type of arms race that both of us are engaged in, and also in terms of the size of the increase in force, whether it is how big it is. Now, if I'm deciding to engage in increase in military capabilities and I'm acquiring more offensive power, and my rival, of course, will do the same, then both of us may be stronger, but overall, both of us will be less capable to defend ourselves. The situation will only get worse. On the other hand, we can argue that if I'm engaging in the acquisition of defensive capabilities, different types of defensive capabilities, and my rival will do the same, then both of us will be much stronger in terms of being able to defend ourselves, and overall the dynamics in the system will be less escalatory because both of us are more capable in terms of our defensive capabilities. And that's where it comes also to the type of weapons. As I said, when the focus is on defensive capabilities, there's less incentives to engage in aggression and in offensive operations, right? If I'm engaging in enlarging my own ground forces, so this is more of an indication for more defensive capabilities. So it's going to be less escalatory if my decision for going to an arms race will be to acquire more nuclear weapons, which have much more escalatory effects, right? So the type of arms race that I'm engaged in also matter. Another important aspect in this case is what's called the signaling intention and understanding my intention. An arms increase may lead my adversary, if I'm engaged in I'm engaged in an arms increase, that may lead my adversary to change her beliefs about what are my intentions. It will view me as a lot more dangerous. And sometimes she may see me as what's called the greedy behavior, which means my intentions were not just to ensure my security, but I'm actually engaged in an arms race beyond any kind of security concern. So maybe I'm trying to expand beyond just feeling myself secure. That's the problem with those understanding what my intentions are. In order to identify those kinds of situations, we should be able to rely on what's called the signaling powers of action. So actions have important effect in signaling what is the intentions behind those kinds of actions. So if I'm deciding to increase in my military forces beyond the needs for just the defense of my security, this is more likely to be a signal of intentions which are greedy intentions, which are just beyond ensuring my own security, which is bad because that's going to make my rival more concerned. The type of force that I'm engaging, just like I said earlier, I didn't speak directly to intentions, but it comes back to it, also matters. If I'm engaged in arms race, which involves only offensive weapons, it's more likely to be viewed by my adversary as a greedy behavior. I don't need more offensive weapons in order to defend my own territory, right? So that's going to be a problematic thing for my rival, and my rival will be a lot more worried about uh, my behavior. Okay, so an arms race is one type of behavior that if I decide to engage in, I'm more likely, again, depending on the type of weapons that I'm acquiring or the dynamics at the time, why I'm more likely to create this dynamics of the security dilemma and overall to create less security for me over the long run. The other type, now you see that, is what's called incentives for expansion. That is, I'm engaged in some types of actions that again makes my adversary feel less secure. And as a result, I'm creating incentive for my rival to explore expansion as a way to compensate for that loss in security. That may be acquiring more territory for strategic depth. That can be securing her own borders because she's more worried about me. That might be trying to obtain more resources. Again, all of that is intended in order to create for her rival, for her perception, feeling of compensating for the loss of security because I decided to engage in some kind of action, such as, again, I decided to engage in more territory acquisition. I decided to develop more military capability or any kind of those actions. So that's another result of those kinds of actions and how the security dilemma is triggered. As an example, we can think about the concerns that Russia was facing when starting from the mid 1990s all the way through the 2000s, there's a lot of discussions about enlarging of NATO into accepting countries from Central and East Europe. Think about that. That's from the perception of the Russians for a minute, how they view that when NATO, led by the United States, is starting to get more and more territory in East Europe by having Poland, by having Hungary, countries which are right on the Russian border. That creates for them a critical and substantial loss of security. What does that mean to them? Maybe that's part of the reasons that they decided to expand more influence in areas such as Georgia, the country, not the state, and other areas along the Caspian Sea. So that can be part of the explanation for that. But all of that is coming from the basic dynamic of the security dilemma. The Russians were concerned from their relative loss of security. All right, I want to talk a little bit more about the idea of the misperception and the idea of understanding intentions as part of the spiral escalation. How do intentions or understanding the intentions of my rival or how my rival views my intentions, how those things affect a spiral escalation that might lead to conflict? Sometimes leaders assume that when they decide to take action in the foreign policy area, other countries will operate under the same logics. And if they decide to engage in an action such as increasing in their military capabilities, it will not be viewed by their rivals as greedy intentions. If they decide to move their military forces around and put them closer to some border, then my rival will not think about this as a risk for her, but will just understand that I'm just moving forces around in order to provide some kind of additional information for others. So this is what a lot of times leaders are assuming. However, in many cases, this is a very erroneous assumption. And that leads to the fact that I decided to engage in an arms increase. And I did not think my rival will see that as greedy behavior, but my rival actually see that in greedy behavior and engages in her own military buildup. And then we're going into this spiral escalation. And I, which made the initial action, failed to understand that this whole escalatory dynamics has come from my initial action, which I thought was perceived properly by my rival, but that's not the case. My rival viewed that in a negative way, viewed it as a greedy behavior. And that's part of the problem in this case. I want to give you an example for that, not with an arms not with an arms race example, but actually with the movement of forces. And to do that, we will travel to the Middle East to the 1960s. What you have here is a map of the Middle East in 1960. What we have here, of course, is the state of Israel. In the late 1950s, two of Israel's neighbors, the Arab countries of Syria over here, that green area over here, and Egypt over here, they have decided to sign an agreement and cooperate together, and they have established what was called the United Arab Republic. That was intended mostly to make sure that they are sharing their interest and they're securing themselves against any kind of threat, mostly led at the time threats from aggression from Israel. The area that we have here, this is the Sinai Peninsula. I'm not sure how much you are familiar with, so I'll give you some background about that now. The Sinai Peninsula is part of Egypt, is right on, this is the Israeli southern border. In the 1956 war between Israel and Egypt, Israeli military forces have entered into the Sinai Peninsula and actually took control of the peninsula all the way to the Red Sea down here. As part of the agreement for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from there, Egypt has made an assurance not to send military forces into the peninsula. So all the Egyptian military had to be situated on the west bank of the Suez Canal, which is this line over here. So this is just the background. There was also a presence of UN forces right on the border here between Egypt and Israel. So all this area, the peninsula over here, is supposed to be with no military presence by either Israel, of course, or Egypt. So that's just the background. Now, in the late 1950s, early in the year of 1960, there was a lot of tensions and aggressions between Israel and Syria. Most of it was focused around that area here, the northern border, right by the Golan Heights. And what I'm talking about right now is a crisis that took place in February of 1960, when continued tensions between Israel and Syria led to multiple clashes along the border. The Egyptian president at the time, Nasser, wanted to deter Israel from further aggression against his ally, right? Because the Syrians were the Egyptians' ally at the time. So what he did, he decided to move some of his very small amount of his military forces into the Sinai Peninsula. That actions by the Egyptians were not anticipated by Israel intelligence and defense forces, and they were caught. They led to a very significant concerns in Israel, to an alarm in Israel, and a mobilization of almost 10,000 soldiers. Essentially, the whole dynamic led to a growing crisis between both countries. When Israel was intended to send military to the border, it also had military here, and it didn't want to have to face an attack both from the north and the south. The entire thing could have been a lot worse, but eventually, after a few days and also debates with the UN, the Egyptian president decided to pull back his forces and to push them back beyond the Suez Canal, and the crisis lasted a time with no actual conflict between both countries. But the example here, the reason I gave you this historical example, is to demonstrate those ideas of intentions and misunderstanding the intentions. Nasser's intentions at the time were not actually to engage in conflict with Israel. It was just intended to send to Israel a signal: you need to stop this aggression with my ally back in the northern border. But Israel did not perceive that the same way. Israel perceived that as a clear, aggressive action by the Egyptians and sent its forces down to the southern border in order to respond. This whole thing could have led to a much more severe escalation and potentially war, if not for eventually both sides deciding to back down. But that's exactly the idea behind this security dilemma. When Nasser, the Egyptian president, decided to send its forces into the Sinai Peninsula back in early 1960, he actually faced that security dilemma. If I'm sending my forces, will that send Israel the message that I'm engaged and I want to go into a conflict now, or I'm just trying to deter them? At the time, this is exactly what it led to, and that is part of those problems. Okay, a little bit more about the offensive-defensive balance and the security dilemma. So as I said, I talked about that when I talked about neorealism overall, and when I talked about it a few minutes ago when I just introduced the concept of the security dilemma. When the weapons that dominate the interactions between states, when the type of interactions are mostly defensive capabilities, then arm races are less likely overall, and stability is a lot more certain in the relations between states. When states are engaged in arms race which involve acquiring more offensive weapons, then those arms races are likely to expand beyond just the basics acquisition of weapons, and there can be more incentives to the escalation into war when states are focusing on offensive capabilities. Why? Because once I acquire more offensive weapons, war is viewed more quick. It's viewed as more profitable because I can actually get benefits from winning the war quickly. Expansion using those kinds of military tools is viewed also as more profitable. And finally, the idea behind first strike advantage is high when I have a large amount of offensive capability, which make preemption more likely. So if I'm having a lot of offensive capabilities and my rival views that, my rival may decide to actually engage in a preemptive attack. And there you go. I decided to engage in a little bit more expansion of my military capabilities by acquiring more offensive weapons. And I actually led my rival to decide to engage in a preemptive action and attack me. And we ended up in war. So this is just a little bit more about the problematic aspect of the types of arms race that countries are engaged in and how that may lead based on the background. We always have this dynamic of the security dilemma, how it might lead to war. Okay. All right. Let's move ahead. Okay, so this is the final thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to the neorealism. I want to finish up by talking a little bit about some of its limitations and the challenges that this specific theoretical framework is facing. I talked about the background. I talked about how it has those assumptions which explains the basic system conditions which lead to the creation of the security dilemma. Let's talk a little bit more in general about some of the limitations of the theory. The criticizing this theory, the main thing is that it's relatively an abstract theory. It lacks clear details about the causes of conflict, mostly because it ignores the internal structure of states. So it does not provide us with a clear detail about what led to the conflict. They say we have those security dilemma, which I talked about, but even a security dilemma in the case between Israel and Egypt did not lead to conflict. It led to a high degree of tensions, but it did not lead to conflict. What would have led to a conflict? Maybe something smaller in that level, not necessarily something which reside in the neo-realist theory levels of analysis. The second point, again, is the less attention given to lower level types of conflict. As I said when I talked on Monday about the difference between the balance of power system, the realist system, and the bipolar system that the neorealist approach is providing with us. One of the benefits that those that promote the support for neorealism suggest is that it prevents large conflict between the major powers in the system, which is true. Throughout the Cold War, as I said on Monday, the two large, strong powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, did not engage in direct confrontation. So the neo-realist view of a system based on two poles is more stable in that sense. But it ignores the relatively large amount of conflicts and interactions and proxy wars that took place during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union have clashed in multiple occasions during the Cold War, whether it was in some of the wars in the Middle East, whether it was in East Asia, whether it was in East Europe, and those kinds of things. And this is not part of the discussion when we talk about their neo-realist approach, and it's part of the problem. The third point is more general. The number one thing that neo-realist approach provides us is survival, right? But survival, it is important, yet it is not the only interest that states have in the international system. So this is a couple of the limitations of the theory. More specifically, when it comes to the security dilemma, the first thing is inconsistent logic, which is a problem, reminding you again the discussion from last week when I talked about the importance of having consistency and among the different aspects of a theory, if we assume a system of states that mostly trying to maximize security, right? That's neorealism. How is it possible that some of those states misinterpret the objectives of others? That's the question that comes. Because if all of us, under the assumption of neorealism, are trying to maximize our security, how is it possible that my rival will misinterpret my signal? I decided to acquire more weapons because I want to ensure my security, but my rival misinterpreted that. How can we explain that? What actually that means in reality is that uncertainty is a lot more powerful than neorealism allows us to argue. The security dilemma is a real problem, and it has a lot of effect on additional motives that states may have. It's not just ensuring their own security. The second point is I talked about defensive realism, which was the main school of thought led that is discussed about as part of the neo-realist theory. There is also an offensive realism approach. According to offensive realists, actors try to maximize their security, but how do they do that? By pursuing enlargement of the military power. So instead of just maximizing security by enlarging their defensive capabilities, according to offensive realists, we are engaged in maximizing their military power in order to ensure security. And this is an approach which, on some level, it ignores the strategic aspect of the security dilemma, which is a problem on some level. Okay, let's move on. Just a minute, I'm sorry about that. Okay, let's move ahead. So this is neorealism. I talked a little bit more even on the security dilemma, what's part of neorealism. And if you have more questions about this theory, of course, we can talk about that. Another material theory, which explains the interactions between powerful states, which was also the focus of the neorealist approach, is power transition theory. Power transition theory explain interactions between powerful states in the international system and provide us the conditions for war and peace. The theory was proposed by a scholar named Organsky back in the late 1950s. It shares several similar aspects to the realist theory, most notably the importance of power. Power transition theory focuses on the strongest states, and it draws its implications from their interactions for war, as well as the maintenance and changes to the structure of the international system. So the structure here is also very, very important. Power is a central element in power transition theory, but there's also an important role given to the what's called the status quo. The status quo is the general pattern of diplomatic, economic, political, and military interactions between the different members of the global system. And the status quo also relates to how much each one of those members of the system is satisfied with the existing conditions. The theory, power transition theory, views the dominant states as the one that establishes the order and sets the rules that direct the political, economic, diplomatic, and military interaction between states. So the one dominant state set the rules that create direct all those interactions. Now, the incentives for the powerful states to sustain the order is that it gets benefits from that. It gets benefits in terms of wealth, in terms of security, in terms of prestige. So since the powerful states provide the dominant power, since the existing order, provides the dominant states with benefits, it will fight to preserve that order. So one dominant state will fight to preserve its place in this international system. The focus of the theory in this case is not just the idea of power and security, but also control over the rules, over the norms of the international system. Nevertheless, power still represents an essential factor in enforcing the existing order. So if one country wants to remain the dominant states in the international system based on power transition theory, it has to ensure it has sufficient power in order to enforce all the rules that this country is setting up. Right? So this is just basic concepts that are important within that theory. Let's see how does power transition theory explains interactions and the way that actors behave in the global system. In contrast to realism and neorealism in that sense, according to power transition theory, the international system is not an anarchy, it actually is a hierarchy. It consists of several clusters of states. The most powerful and influential states are at the top category, and this is the smallest category in size. So there's one, maybe two most powerful influential states in the system. The largest category involves many small states, who has few resources and low amount of influence. Think about countries such as Laos or Haiti, or countries in Africa such as Chad. Those are small countries which do not have a lot of effect on the international system. The middle category involves what's called middle powers, which have some influence. We can think about countries such as the Netherlands, maybe, or maybe Pakistan, and those are the middle category. The most powerful states in the system draw their power from a combination of factors, mostly their economic capabilities, their national wealth, as well as their overwhelming military power. Another aspect of that theory, and that's where it comes into the next point, is that some states are defined according to that theory as satisfied states with international order. Some, and in that case, most states are described as dissatisfied. What exactly are those two types of states? So dissatisfied actors are those who are not satisfied with the status quo. They are unaccepting of the existing order in the international system. They do not accept the rules that currently are running the international system. But what matters in terms of the dissatisfied states is only the ones in the upper tier, because if you're not strong enough, then you're not representing a threat to the international peace and stability. If a dissatisfied country has the tools and has the military power and overall power, not just military power, then that country will try to change the order and rise to the top. Okay, let's see what else we have here. The dominant state in the system sets the rules of behavior and enforces them along with other satisfied states within her own coalition. So there are satisfied powers which agree with the existing order. So they're part of the coalition of the dominant power, and all of them are enforcing those rules. A system transforming conflict is only likely when a dissatisfied power has gains sufficient capabilities to challenge the existing order. And that means that there is an important role for what's called relative power. If a state will grow enough to be closely equal to dominant power in terms of her capability, then the risk of war will depend whether that challenger is satisfied with the existing order or dissatisfied with the existing order and wants to change it. Once another country is powerful enough and equal, it has a relative power enough, close enough to the dominant state, once it's strong enough, it is possible that war is going to take place with the objective who will control and who will set the rules of the game. A victory by the challenger will lead to changes in the orders of the global system, and peace is only possible when the dominant power remains the dominant power. Okay. Now, there's also a possibility of having in this international system, as this theory predicts, is going to be a rising power, but a rising power that is satisfied with status quo. This kind of country will not challenge the dominant power, since it will have no marginal gains from a conflict with the dominant power. They are satisfied with the existing status quo. This condition serves as a clear distinction between power transition theory and realist theory. Why? Because if a country is satisfied with the status quo, even if it is able to obtain more power and be almost as powerful as the most dominant state in the system, there is still no incentives for conflict. That's the opposite, because according to the realist theory, if one country gains enough power, it can challenge, it will balance against the most dominant power. In this case, according to power transition theory, it will not balance against the dominant power because it is satisfied with the existing order. It is satisfied with the existing status quo. All right, let's see. All right, so that's a lot of very abstract arguments. Let's talk a little bit about examples, right? So what example do we have for a dominant power in the international system, the way that is described by the power transition theory? The United States. The dominant power in the system since World War II mostly had a lot of advantages during the 1990s and the early 2000s, and maybe less so over the last 10 years or so. But let's talk a little bit about that. Following the Second World War, the United States emerged as the dominant power in the international system, and it established a large variety of rules, norms, and institutions to promote its own interests. So, as I said, the dominant power in the system, that's what the theory tells us, will set the rules, will set the order in ways that's going to provide with benefits. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of examples of what the United States did following the Second World War, which helped the United States solidify its position as the most dominant state in the system and gain benefits from that. So, for example, the Bretton Woods Agreement was a currency regime led by the United States following the Second World War. It made the US dollar the main currency standard that other currencies were valued against. It made the US dollar the most powerful currency in the global exchange and world markets, which essentially placed the United States at the center of the global economy. So that was a very powerful tool set up by the United States in order to ensure its place as the most dominant state in the system and gain the benefits, in that case, many economic benefits. For example, during that time, and even now for that matter, crude oil is one of the most important central commodities in the international markets, and it is traded based on US dollars, which provides a lot of benefits to the United States. In addition, the United States has pushed for the establishment of institutions such as the GATT, which later turned to be the World Trade Organization, an important institution, which we're going to talk about when we talk about international institutions, in promoting global market economy and free trade. In the political area, the United States promoted norms such as establishing democratic institutions and securing human rights. In the context of security and military capabilities, the United States has pushed for the establishment of NATO. All members of NATO have shared the fear of the Soviet Union in the early days of the Cold War, right after the Second World War, of course. But at the same time, those group of countries in NATO also share some of the norms of democracy and some degree of safeguarding human rights, at least in their own territory. Not all those countries has the same degree of securing human rights similar to the United States, but they were closer in that. So the interests were not just countering or the fear from the Soviet Union, there were others as well, most of them promoted by the United States. Another organization that was established was the United Nations. It was aimed mostly to promote peace throughout the world. During a lot of the disputes in the past, American president has tended to lean hard on the United Nations in order to rally a multilateral military action. For example, support by the UN for the first Iraqi war, support by the UN in the Afghanistan war, as well as the interventions the United States have made in Haiti and Somalia. And in all those cases, the UN served an important role in supporting the US action. It also served an important role in other policy actions, for example, when sanctions were leveled against Iran. So all those types of actions were taken by the United States as the dominant power in the system and was mostly intended to consolidate its place. Okay. All right, so let's go back to talk a little bit more about the theoretical aspect of power transition theory. Conditions for war. According to that theory, if a dissatisfied country gains enough power to challenge the status quo, a conflict is likely. Since this kind of a conflict presents a challenge to the full order of the international system, the war that is going to take place is likely to be very, very costly and it has the potential to alter or transform the system. When both rivals, the dominant state and the challenger, which again, reminding you, has to be a dissatisfied state in order for war to be more likely. When both rivals are just about equal in their power, then war is more likely to take place. And this is a time period which is called the power transition period. Now, this condition when it comes to equal amounts of power and how that may lead to war, also based on levels of dissatisfaction. This condition explains the difference. Once again, I come back to that with the realist views, because think about a balance of power system under this perception or under those conditions of the power transition theory. A balance of power system, the way that it's described by the realists, enlarges the risk of war based on power transition theory, because it places the major actors in the international system on almost equal footing in terms of their capabilities. Because according to the balance of power, all the strong countries in the world have pretty much the same level of power. So the only thing, if we go now, we shift to power transition theory, the only thing that prevents those kinds of situations to escalate into war is whether those powers actually are satisfied or dissatisfied from the current status quo. The likelihood of not escalating into war in those conditions, so the conditions that might help us prevent war, one is the dominant power understand that situation, and it will not allow its challenger, a weaker state, to challenge it, so it has incentives to engage in a preemptive attack. So the dominant power views the challenger as getting more and more powerful, wants to prevent the war that's going to take place eventually when the challenger is going to be strong enough. So therefore, the dominant power will engage in a preemptive attack. It doesn't have to be a preemptive war for that matter. It can also be the prevention of war if the rising power, the challenger, decides to wait, the emerging power decide to wait with the conflict until it has enough sufficient power, because it's concerned if it's not going to wait until it has sufficient power, it might lose this system changing conflict. So this is a couple of conditions that might prevent war when both of those countries are almost equal in their capabilities. Some empirical evidence for this theory. One example, for those dynamics is Germany before World War II. Germany has accumulated more and more power and challenged the existing status quo in Europe and in the world at the end of the 1930s. That essentially led to World War II. But the challenge from Germany at that time was unsuccessful because the war ended with pretty much still countries of the West dominated the international system, led to the United States being the dominant power after the war. But again, the behavior that Germany has exhibited before the Second World War during the late 1920s and early 1930s fit with those dynamics, with this arguments led by that theory of a challenger which gains more and more power, and eventually, because this challenger is dissatisfied with the status quo, it leads to war. Another example which we can talk about is the United Kingdom and the United States at the end of the 19th century. As the United States gained more and more power, the United States was not really satisfied with the way that the international system was organized at the time, but eventually it did not lead to war. Okay, and finally, we can also talk about the Cold War is a potential example for that theory, right? Because we have two strong powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. One of them is clearly dissatisfied with the existing order. The Soviet Union was not satisfied with the international order the way it was established by the United States. Why didn't we actually have war? That's a question we can come up with. Well, basically, the United States, of course, is the dominant power during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was the challenger. But in reality, when we actually go into understanding the actual conditions and the actual capabilities that the Soviets had at the time, the Soviets never achieved parity with the United States. So if we follow the arguments laid out by power transition theory, war was never expected to occur. The end of the Cold War, it was mostly a result of the Soviet system's failure to sustain the competition with the United States, which again, that fits into that prism of the power transition theory, right? Because they try to expand their own power, they get the relative power to the right place, but they were unable to sustain that pursuit of the United States. And that led to the defeat of the Soviet Union, that led them to accept conciliation in the form of accepting democratization, privatization of their economy, and decreasing their military confrontation with the United States. What else do we have here? Let's think about the end of the Cold War and the way that is described by power transition theory. After the end of the Cold War, there was relatively optimism in terms of the ability of the United States to remain the dominant power in the system, right? Especially in the 1990s, the United States have even consolidated its place as the dominant power in the system even more. But still, especially over the last 10, 15 years, there's reasons to be cautious about thinking about those arguments set up by power transition theory and the way that the international system is today. The Soviet decline at the time meant that there is no clear competition with the United States, and led to, of course, a clear decrease in the chances of war between those states. The processes that Russia has experienced in the 1990s, of course, especially in the first half of the 1990s, further strengthened those predictions that war is not likely between the United States and Russia, even when it began regaining some of its old power, because at the time, after those processes in the early 1990s, Russia was still seen as it was satisfied with the international order that the United States was leading at the time. Okay. Still, one thing we need to remember about is another rising power, and I'm sure that this is the one that jumped up to your head when we talk about especially over the last 20, 25 years, and this is China. China clearly does not reside in the camp of the satisfied state. It has posted impressive growth rates over the years before the 1990s, into the 1990s, and into the 2000s. And it led some to expect that once China will achieve parity with the United States in the upcoming years, a war is very possible. If we talk about those dynamics within the context of power transition theory, is that if those patterns will continue and China will remain unsatisfied with the status quo, it is likely that war will take place. This is what the theory tells us. Okay, now, after I did not do that on Monday, I'm doing that now. I'm stopping for the attendance word today. For today, the attendance word is the word February as the months of February in which we are now. So for today, the attendance word is February. And that's going to lead me to the final summary of today. On Monday and today, I talked about the main structural theories of IR, realism, neorealism, and power transition theory. When we think about all those three theories, we can think about one of their common aspects that they have, viewing the international system as the main structure that determines the behavior of the various units, the various states. All those three theories also share some of the assumptions, such as states pursuing or behaving in a rational way. States are following or should be viewed within the unitary actor assumption, right? We should view the states as one. We do not care what happened within those states. The material aspects which lead the explanations that those theories are providing are mostly military and economic power, and those are the main tools of statecraft. At the same time, those theories has clear differences. For example, the focus on power versus security between realism and neorealism. How does this focus on either one of these leads to the difference between a multipolar system and a bipolar system, and how each one of them may lead to war? Also, think about power transition theory, which focuses not just on power for the sake of power, it also talks about power in the context of having control over the rules, the order, and the norms of the system, which substantially deviates in some level from the classic realist perceptions, but it has some elements that relate to the theories of realism. Okay, with that, I am done for today. You have a little bit more reading here if you're interested in those topics. Reminding you once again, don't forget the attendance board, which was given today, and don't forget to answer your quiz by Monday. Reminding you one more time, the questions on the quiz are related to the readings of next week, week 4. So if you have any more questions about that, you are more than welcome to email to me. With that, I am done for today. I hope that by Monday I will be back to normal. Reminding you once again, also as I sent you also on the email on the announcement, there will be no face-to-face meeting on Friday because I'm still quarantining with my family. But hopefully everything will get back to normal next week. So with that, I'm saying goodbye, and I will see you next week.